Hi, I'm Viviane Stappmanns. I'm a curator at the Vitra Design Museum, and I look after a very special place at the Vitra campus, which is called the Vitra Design Museum Gallery. So the gallery is a much smaller exhibition space than the big Vitra Design Museum. And here we really concentrate on showing contemporary positions in design or architecture. What we see here at the moment is an exhibition by a French collective of very young designers called Typologie. And what they do is they focus on objects, everyday objects that we don't necessarily think of as designed objects. In fact, they're not at all designed objects. And they research the history and the materials and the manufacturing of that object really in depth, and then they make a publication about that object. When we met them, they had already made one publication about wine corks, and another one about wine bottles, and another one about a very, very French object, the boules or pétanque ball. What's really interesting is that these balls were made from wood originally, but then as the game sort of became tougher and faster, people also needed tougher balls, so they started to stud them with nails, and the Collection Typologie have really put together some really interesting objects where you can see how these bull balls were actually studded. But what's very interesting then is that in France, at the time of industrialization, these balls started to be made in industrial processes, and it was actually in an area that was quite known for its weapons and projectiles industry. So these balls, in a way, were made using the know-how of people who made cannonballs or bullets, and so they're actually kind of made in the same way, and that's resulted in a very tough kind of ball that initially is just a piece of metal that is flattened and then made into two spheres, which are then put together and then polished so you can't see the seam anymore, and eventually end up in a really, really strong ball. And that in turn, and this is really interesting, has influenced how this game is being played, because now it's a very competitive game. It's played really fast on really kind of tough grounds. It's a very precise game. You may have seen people with little measuring tapes really measuring the distance between those balls. So it's interesting how initially the ball was shaped to fit the game, and now the game kind of fits the actual object that was being made. So the next object they investigated was wine corks, and they are interesting not because how they evolved over time, but because how they haven't. They've actually been essentially the same thing for a long, long time. Essentially what a wine cork is, it's just a piece of bark from a cork oak, and that is harvested, and then as you can kind of see here, these little bits of cork are just stamped out of it. So those are the really high quality corks. In the end, this piece of that sort of remains is ground into a sort of granules, and then you can see that sort of lesser quality corks are made out of that. But that's sort of in between that there are lots of different shapes, champagne corks that are made out of a mixture of big pieces of bark and then those granules. But in essence, it's an object that hasn't changed much. And when it was changed to plastic corks, there was a lot of upheaval about it, because it's such a traditional industry that no one really wanted it to change. And that's also a really interesting thing to realize. So when Collection Typologie do their big investigations, they mainly focus on three elements. How is something being made? So what's the manufacturing process? What is the material? And what is the social history of that object? Somewhere where that's quite evident is the wine bottle. It's also a very old object, and if you look at the really old examples that we've got here, you can see that the shape of the bottle actually hasn't changed so much. These are still hand-blown bottles, and initially it was a much plumper kind of shape, so When it was made through industrial glassblowing processes, it became a little bit more elegant and neat, but at the same time, it really hasn't changed so much, just like the cork. And that sort of begs the question, has it not changed because it was perfect from the beginning? Has it not changed because we don't really want it to change, because we're very traditional when it comes to wine? No one wants to change things. Or why is it really that it hasn't changed? And when Collection Typologie asked those questions, they realized there are some small changes. For instance, in glass, like this very orange glass that you see here, that's something that in the Rhine region was often used, so the winemakers there could distinguish themselves through sort of a slightly different color glass. Or in England, a very nice bottle of wine is often distinguished by quite a black, dark bottle. All these things, sort of these nuances of that object come out, and they talk more about what we like as humans than the technological processes, at least in the bottles. Now's the big moment where we talk about the study that we, the Vitra Design Museum and Collection Typologie did together just for this exhibition here, because that was really important to us to say, well, we really want to be part of another investigation of yours. So they came back and said, we want to talk about the wooden vegetable crate. And that was great, because as far as all the objects go that you see here, that probably is the one object that talks most about the relationship between human behavior and habits and an object. As you can sort of see in this video here, the Collection Typologie went out, they visited factories, they really found out how this object is being made. In the exhibition, we've got an entire tree, one of those trees that goes into the machine and then gets stripped like a roll of toilet paper, and that is a poplar tree. It's always poplar trees that are made into those boxes because it's a type of timber that doesn't smell, that doesn't kind of splinter very much, and it's cheap. The actual kind of grandparents of this wooden crate were, of course, baskets and also vats to a certain degree. These things were either usually formed like the vegetable that they would hold. This, for instance, is a little egg basket, and so the eggs are the basket is particularly woven so that the eggs can kind of sit in there without rolling around too much. Or this is a cherry picking basket from the area just around here. So it was formed so it would sort of be strapped to your body and sit really well. They were kind of in all different shapes, usually molded to either the body or the thing they were holding. And then we see this sort of more square shape coming in, which meant some stacking needed to be done. So there was a much larger volume of vegetables, and also these crates needed to be stacked to be transported. So what we really see here is an object telling us the history of our own consumption patterns and the industrialization of food, if you like. Sort of starting with these baskets that are very much about the kind of individual vegetable, but also the individual providing that vegetable and taking it to the market. And then this kind of shift to like a square sort of standardized crate where my larger volumes can be transported by more efficient means. And then you might still see boxes that sort of have the name of that manufacturer on them, and they might still belong to them and kind of go back to them. So there's still this kind of connection to the local area. But then very soon it just shifts into all kinds of vessels, plastic crates, cardboard, and all these things are designed to kind of ensure that something can travel and be consumed, and whatever carries it is destroyed right there because it's too complicated to kind of move it back. So in many ways, this exhibition is an exhibition about objects and their history, but it's also an exhibition and a research project that is much about the kind of human history or the human story that these objects tell. And that was really interesting to do that, working with objects that are not designed objects, but our everyday objects, because they can just sometimes be just as rich and interesting in the story that they tell.